The James River cut through the Virginia wilderness like a vein of dark mercury, its waters carrying the secrets of a land still raw with possibility and drenched in suffering. In the spring of 1603, the tobacco fields of the Blackwood plantation stretched across 300 acres of cleared forest, a monument to English ambition built on the backs of the first generation of African souls brought to these shores. The plantation house stood elevated on a gentle rise, its timber frame weathered but imposing, overlooking rows of tobacco plants that swayed in the humid breeze like green waves frozen in time. Samuel Blackwood had inherited the land from his uncle 3 years prior, a man whose appetite for wealth had exceeded his capacity for mercy. Samuel was cut from similar cloth, thin-lipped with eyes the color of river stones and hands that had never known the soil they profited from. His overseer, Jacob Harrow, was a different breed entirely. A thick-necked man with a face mapped by smallpox scars, Harrow had come to Virginia from the debtor prisons of London, trading one form of bondage for another. Now he wielded power with the fervor of a man desperate to prove his worth, and his cruelty had become legend among the 23 enslaved Africans who worked the Blackwood fields. Among them was a young man named Kofi, barely 19 years old, his body lean and muscular from 3 years of endless labor. He had been taken from the Gold Coast as a boy, his memories of home reduced to fragments, his mother's voice singing in a can, the taste of fufu, the sound of drums that once gave rhythm to his childhood. Now he answered to Samuel's boy, a name that erased his identity as efficiently as the branding iron had marked his shoulder. Kofi's eyes held a depth that unnerved some of the white workers, a quiet intelligence that Harrow had noticed and grown to resent. The trouble began on a Tuesday morning in late April, when the first heat of approaching summer hung over the plantation like a wet blanket. Harrow had been conducting his weekly inspection of the slave quarters, crude structures of rough timber and mud daub that leaked in the rain and baked like ovens in the summer sun. In Kofi's cabin, shared with 3 other men, Harrow claimed to have discovered a silver buckle tucked beneath a loose floorboard. It was a small thing, tarnished and bent, but Harrow held it aloft like evidence of treason. "Thief!" Harrow's voice boomed across the compound, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. "I knew there was something wrong about this one, always watching, always thinking he's better than his station." Kofi stood in the doorway of the cabin, his face carefully neutral despite the fear coursing through his veins. "Master Harrow, I never—" The blow came fast, Harrow's fist connecting with Kofi's jaw and sending him sprawling into the dirt. The other enslaved workers looked on with expressions ranging from sympathy to terror, knowing that any intervention would bring the lash down on their own backs. 2 of the white field hands, Thomas Weaver and his son James, watched from near the tobacco barn, their faces troubled but silent. "Don't you dare speak unless spoken to," Harrow snarled, standing over Kofi's prone form. "Mr. Blackwood puts food in your belly and a roof over your head, and this is how you repay his Christian charity? By stealing?" Samuel Blackwood emerged from the plantation house, his boots crunching on the gravel path. He surveyed the scene with the detachment of a man examining livestock. "What's happened here, Harrow?" "Caught this one with stolen property, sir. That silver buckle you've been missing since last month. Found it hidden in his quarters." Kofi pushed himself to his knees, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "Master, I swear on my life, I never took nothing. I don't know how—" Silence. Blackwood's voice was soft but carried the weight of absolute authority. He walked slowly around Kofi, considering. "You know the penalty for theft, boy. The law is clear. In England, you'd hang. Here," he paused, letting the words hover in the humid air. "Here, we must set examples. We cannot allow disorder. The others must see that there are consequences." While the attention focused on Kofi and the overseer, no one had noticed the pale face watching from the window of the plantation house. Sarah Blackwood, Samuel's wife of 2 years, pressed her hand against the glass. She was a delicate woman from a merchant family in Jamestown, still adjusting to the brutal realities of plantation life. Something in the scene below troubled her deeply. Perhaps the certainty in Harrow's accusations, or the resignation in the young slave's eyes. Harrow grabbed Kofi by the arm, yanking him to his feet. "What'll it be, sir? The whipping post? Or should we make it something more permanent?" The other enslaved workers had been forced to gather in the compound now, their presence required to witness whatever punishment Blackwood deemed fit. Among them was an older man named Kwame, who had survived the Middle Passage and 7 years of bondage. He watched Kofi with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked anymore, but his jaw clenched as Harrow shoved the young man forward. "The river," Blackwood said finally, his voice carrying across the silent assembly. "Let God judge his guilt or innocence. If he's innocent, the Lord will spare him. If he's a thief, the river will take him as payment for his sin." A murmur rippled through the gathered slaves, quickly silenced by Harrow's glare. The James River was treacherous this time of year, swollen with spring rains and running fast with currents that had claimed more than one unwary traveler. To be thrown into it, bound and unable to swim, was a death sentence dressed in the language of divine judgment. "Please, master," Kofi's voice broke through the silence, raw with desperation. "I have never stolen from you. I work hard. I cause no trouble. Please, mercy." "Mercy?" Harrow laughed, a harsh sound like stones grinding together. "You want mercy after spitting on your master's generosity. The river's more mercy than you deserve." As the sun climbed higher, casting short shadows across the compound, Harrow and 2 of the burlier field hands, men who had learned that following orders was safer than questioning them, dragged Kofi toward the path that led through the tobacco fields to the river's edge. The enslaved workers were forced to follow, a grim procession through the green rows where they had all labored side by side. Some of the women wept quietly. Kwame walked with his head bowed, his lips moving in what might have been prayer, or might have been curses in his native tongue. Sarah Blackwood watched from the house until the procession disappeared into the tree line, then turned away from the window, her hand trembling as she reached for the brandy her husband kept in his study. She poured a small measure and drank it quickly, trying to silence the voice in her head that whispered this was wrong, that her husband was not the righteous man she had believed him to be. The path to the river wound through stands of oak and pine, the forest floor soft with decades of fallen needles and leaves. Birds called from the canopy above, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. When they reached the riverbank, the water stretched before them, brown and swift, carrying branches and debris from upstream. The far shore was barely visible through the morning mist that still clung to the water's surface. Harrow produced a length of rope, weathered and rough, and began binding Kofi's hands behind his back. The young man's breathing had grown shallow, his eyes darting between the river and the faces of those gathered. He looked for mercy and found none among the white men, only grim determination to see this through. Among his own people, he saw fear and helpless rage, emotions they had all learned to swallow down like bitter medicine. "Any last words, thief?" Harrow asked, tightening the knots until they bit into Kofi's wrists. Kofi's voice, when it came, was stronger than anyone expected. He spoke not in English, but in Akan, words that flowed like water, addressing the spirit world his mother had taught him about before she was torn from his life. The white men shifted uncomfortably, unnerved by the foreign syllables. Kwame's eyes widened in recognition. He understood fragments of what was being said, a prayer to the ancestors, a plea for justice beyond this world's cruelty. "Enough of that heathen gibberish," Blackwood snapped, having followed the procession to witness his judgment carried out. "Into the water with him." The field hands grabbed Kofi by the arms and legs, carrying him to the edge where the bank dropped away sharply. For a moment, suspended between earth and water, Kofi's eyes met Kwame's one last time. Then they swung him back and forward, releasing him on the forward arc. He hit the water with a splash that seemed too small for the weight of injustice it carried, and the current immediately began pulling him downstream. For several seconds, Kofi's head broke the surface, his body twisting as he fought against the bonds and the river's pull. His mouth opened, whether to scream or gasp for air, no one could tell. Then the brown water closed over him, and he disappeared from view. The gathered crowd stood in silence, watching the spot where he had vanished, as if expecting him to somehow miraculously resurface, vindicated by divine intervention. But the river flowed on, indifferent and ancient, keeping its secrets. After several long minutes, Blackwood turned away. "It's done. Back to work, all of you. We have tobacco to tend, and standing here won't bring in the crop." His voice carried the brisk efficiency of a man who had already moved past what had just occurred, filed it away as a regrettable but necessary piece of business. As the enslaved workers trudged back toward the plantation, Kwame fell into step beside a woman named Abeni, who had been brought over on the same ship as Kofi. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound. "They will pay," Kwame whispered, in a dialect only she could understand. "The river has taken him, but the river remembers. This land will remember." That night, as darkness settled over the Blackwood plantation, an uneasy quiet descended. The enslaved workers huddled in their quarters, some praying to the Christian God they had been taught to worship, others invoking the spirits of their homeland in whispered voices. In the main house, Samuel Blackwood sat with his ledgers, recording the day's loss of property, with the same clinical detachment he used for noting a broken plough or a sick horse. Sarah sat across from him, her needlework forgotten in her lap, staring at the candle flame and seeing in it the image of a young man disappearing beneath dark water. 3 days passed, and life on the plantation resumed its brutal rhythm. The tobacco plants grew taller, their broad leaves reaching toward the sun. The enslaved workers moved through their tasks with the mechanical efficiency born of survival, though more than one glanced toward the river when they thought no one was watching. Harrow strutted about with renewed authority, his punishment of Kofi having cemented his position as a man not to be crossed. Blackwood conducted his business with visiting merchants from Jamestown, negotiating prices for his tobacco crop with the same cold calculation that governed every aspect of his life. But on the morning of the 4th day, something changed. Thomas Weaver, the field hand who had witnessed Kofi's sentence, came running from the direction of the river, his face pale and his breath coming in gasps. He burst into the compound where Harrow was overseeing the morning work assignments, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. "Mr. Harrow, sir! You need to come! The river, there's something—" Thomas struggled to form coherent sentences, his hands shaking as he pointed back toward the path. Harrow frowned, irritated at the interruption. "Spit it out, man. What about the river?" "A body, sir, washed up on the far bank, but it's not right. Something's not right about it." The words sent a chill through everyone who heard them. Harrow exchanged a look with James Weaver, Thomas's son, then called out to 2 of the other field hands. "You 2, come with me, the rest of you, back to work." He turned to one of the enslaved workers. "You go fetch Mr. Blackwood. Tell him we may have found the thief's body." The small party made its way through the morning mist toward the river, Thomas leading the way and casting nervous glances over his shoulder, as if expecting something to be following them. When they reached the bank, they had to walk upstream for nearly half a mile, following Thomas's directions, until they came to a bend where the current had deposited its cargo against a fallen log. What they found stopped them all in their tracks. There was indeed a body caught in the debris, face down in the shallow water, but even from a distance, something about it seemed wrong. The clothing appeared to be the rough cotton shirt and breeches that Kofi had been wearing, but the body itself seemed different, distorted. As they drew closer, Harrow felt his confidence waver for the first time in years. "Help me turn it over," he commanded, but his voice lacked its usual authority. James Weaver, the younger of the two who had accompanied them, waded into the water with visible reluctance. Together they grabbed the body and rolled it onto its back, and what they saw made James stumble backward with a cry of revulsion. The face was bloated and discolored, as might be expected from days in the water, but the features were all wrong. The bone structure seemed to have shifted, the skull elongated in a way that human skulls should not elongate. The mouth hung open, revealing teeth that appeared too numerous and too sharp. Most disturbing of all were the marks covering the exposed skin. Not the marks of decomposition or fish, but strange symbols that seemed to have been carved or burned into the flesh, patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and writhe even as they lay still. "Sweet merciful Christ," Thomas whispered, making the sign of the cross. "What is this thing?" Harrow stood frozen, his mind struggling to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with what he knew to be possible. This couldn't be Kofi, or if it was, something had happened to him in the river, something that defied explanation. The symbols on the skin seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence in the dim morning light, and the longer Harrow stared at them, the more his head began to ache, a sharp pain building behind his eyes. "We need to get Mr. Blackwood," James said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "And maybe the minister from Jamestown. This ain't natural, sir. This ain't right at all." Before Harrow could respond, a sound drifted across the water, soft at first, then growing louder. It was singing, but unlike any song they had heard before. The melody was haunting and strange, words in a language none of them recognized, coming from somewhere upstream. The three white men exchanged glances of growing unease as the song continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, carried on the morning mist that refused to burn away despite the rising sun. And while the overseer ordered the slave to be thrown into the river that spring morning in 1603, he could not have imagined that the waters would return something that would shake the very foundations of what they believed about justice, punishment, and the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of their new world. The river had received their offering, and now it was beginning to make its reply. By midday, word of the discovery had spread through the plantation like wildfire through dry grass. Samuel Blackwood stood on the riverbank, staring down at the thing that had once been, or resembled, Kofi, his face an unreadable mask. Beside him stood Reverend Cotton, a gaunt man of 40 years who had ridden out from Jamestown at Blackwood's urgent summons. The Reverend's fingers clutched his worn Bible so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and his lips moved in silent prayer as he studied the grotesque corpse. "It's witchcraft," Reverend Cotton pronounced finally, his voice trembling slightly despite his attempt at authority. "The devil's work, these markings, these are the symbols of dark powers, Mr. Blackwood. This boy must have been in league with Satan himself, and his true nature has been revealed through God's judgment." Blackwood wanted to believe this explanation, wanted to accept the simple narrative that would allow him to maintain his understanding of the world. But something nagged at him, a small voice of doubt that he could not entirely silence. He had seen Kofi work for 3 years, had never noticed anything unusual about the young man beyond his quiet dignity and quick mind, nothing that suggested dealings with supernatural forces. "What should we do with it?" Harrow asked, standing a respectful distance away. The overseer's usual swagger had diminished considerably since that morning's discovery. He kept glancing at the body and then looking away, as if afraid that meeting its dead eyes might somehow curse him. "Burn it," Reverend Cotton declared without hesitation. "Burn the body and the clothes. Scatter the ashes in running water and pray over this ground. We must cleanse this place of demonic taint before it spreads." But before they could act on these instructions, a commotion arose from the direction of the slave quarters. Kwame had gathered the other enslaved workers and was leading them toward the river, ignoring Harrow's shouted commands to return to their tasks. The old man's face was set with determination, and when he reached the riverbank, he pushed past the white men to stand over Kofi's transformed body. For a long moment, Kwame simply stared, his weathered face working through expressions of shock, recognition, and something that might have been vindication. Then he began to speak, not in English, but in his native tongue, words that flowed like water over stones. The other enslaved Africans listened with a mixture of fear and awe, while the white men shifted uncomfortably, unnerved by sounds they could not understand. "What's he saying?" Blackwood demanded, grabbing Abeni by the arm. She was one of the few who could speak both English and several African languages. "Translate, woman." Abeni's eyes were wide with terror, but she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He says the river spirits have answered, that Kofi was innocent, and the water has marked him with the truth. He says the marks are not from demons, but from the old powers, the ones that were here before any of us, before the white men, before even his people. He says the river is angry. "Blasphemy!" Reverend Cotton spat, raising his Bible like a shield. "These are lies of the devil. The only power is God's power," and his words were cut short by a sound that froze everyone in place. A deep rumbling that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself, accompanied by a sudden change in the air pressure that made their ears pop. The river, which had been flowing steadily downstream all morning, suddenly seemed to pause, the water growing eerily still. Then impossibly it began to flow backward, upstream, defying every law of nature. "Mother of God," Thomas Weaver breathed, his face draining of color. "The river's running the wrong way." The reversed current lasted only a few seconds, but it was long enough to send a wave of panic through everyone present. When the water resumed its normal flow, it carried with it something new, dozens of dead fish floating belly up, their eyes clouded and their bodies marked with the same strange symbols that covered Kofi's corpse. They collected in a mass against the riverbank, an offering or a warning that no one could interpret. Sarah Blackwood, who had insisted on accompanying her husband despite his protests, felt her legs give way beneath her. She sat down hard on the damp earth, her fine dress forgotten as she stared at the impossible scene before her. "Samuel," she whispered, "what have we done? What have you done?" But Samuel Blackwood's jaw was set in the stubborn line that his wife had come to recognize as his refuge when confronted with things he could not control or explain. "This changes nothing," he announced, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. "The boy was a thief and got what he deserved. Whatever this is, it's just the natural corruption of death in water, nothing more." "Natural?" Kwame's voice rang out, startling everyone because he spoke now in clear, accented English. "You call this natural? You throw innocent man in river with lies in your mouth, and you call what comes back natural?" He spat on the ground at Harrow's feet, an act of defiance that would normally earn him a brutal beating. But no one moved to stop him. "The spirits know. The water knows. Truth has a way of rising to the surface, Master Blackwood." Harrow finally found his voice, anger overcoming his unease. "You dare speak to your betters that way, old man? You want to join your friend in the river?" But before the confrontation could escalate, young James Weaver called out from further upstream, "Sir, Mr. Blackwood, there's more here, more bodies." The group rushed upstream, slipping on the muddy bank in their haste to find James, standing before a section of riverbank where the current had carved away the earth, exposing the roots of old trees. Caught among these roots were 3 more bodies, all in advanced stages of decomposition, all bearing the same inexplicable markings. These were clearly not recent deaths. The state of the remains suggested they had been in the water for months, perhaps years. Yet the symbols on their flesh glowed with the same faint luminescence, seemingly untouched by decay. "I know that one," Thomas Weaver said slowly, pointing to the least decomposed of the three bodies. That was John Milton's servant, the one he said ran away last autumn. And that there, good Lord, that might be the Indian woman from the settlement upriver, the one who disappeared during the winter. Reverend Cotton's face had gone from pale to grey. His hands shook as he clutched his Bible. His earlier confidence entirely evaporated. "This is beyond my understanding," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "We need to send word to the bishop in England. This is something I cannot explain or combat alone." As they stood frozen by this revelation, trying to process the implications, a new sound reached their ears, the sound of horses approaching at speed. Within moments, a party of men on horseback burst through the tree line, led by a barrel-chested man in his 50s, whom Blackwood recognized as William Farrow, who owned the plantation to the north. Behind him rode 5 other planters from the region, all looking grim and determined. "Blackwood," Farrow called out, reining in his horse, "we need to talk. Something's happened at my place, and I've been hearing similar stories from up and down the river. Animals dying for no reason, water running strange colors, and my slaves, they've been acting peculiar, saying things about the river being angry, about spirits and judgment." His eyes fell on the bodies on the bank, and his face paled. "Sweet Christ, so it's true. The river is giving back what's been fed to it." Over the next hour, as the sun climbed toward its zenith and the heat grew oppressive, a terrible picture began to emerge. Farrow and the other planters shared their stories. Slaves who had been punished by drowning, servants who had disappeared under suspicious circumstances, Indians who had been disposed of after conflicts over land. All had been thrown into the James River, their bodies consigned to the water with the assumption that they would be carried away, forgotten, absorbed into the wilderness. But now the river was returning them, marked with symbols no one could read, transformed in ways that defied explanation. "How many?" Sarah Blackwood asked, her voice hollow. "How many people have been thrown into this river?" No one wanted to answer, but the silence spoke volumes. This was the James River, the lifeblood of the Virginia colony, and it had witnessed countless acts of violence since the English had arrived. Indigenous peoples slaughtered for their land, indentured servants who had become inconvenient, enslaved Africans who had resisted or simply been unlucky enough to draw the attention of cruel masters. The water had swallowed them all, and for years it had kept their secrets. But something had changed. Something had awakened or been disturbed, and now the river was speaking in a language written on dead flesh, a testimony to crimes that the living had tried to forget. Kwame watched the white men argue among themselves about what to do, their voices rising in panic and recrimination. He felt no satisfaction in their fear, only a bone-deep weariness. He had survived the Middle Passage, had endured 7 years of bondage, had learned to swallow his rage and his grief day after day. But standing here, seeing Kofi's transformed body and the others that the river had returned, he felt something shift inside him. The old stories his grandmother had told him, the ones about how the land itself remembers, about how injustice feeds something ancient and hungry. Those stories suddenly felt less like myths and more like warnings that should have been heeded. "We burn them all," Blackwood finally declared, trying to reassert control over the situation. "Burn the bodies, scatter the ashes, and we speak of this to no one. The colony cannot afford panic. If word reaches Jamestown, if the company hears that there's something wrong with this region—" "Something wrong?" Sarah interrupted, her voice sharp. "Samuel, there are dead bodies rising from the river marked with signs none of us understand, and you're worried about the company's opinion. What if this is God's judgment on us? What if we're being held accountable for—" "Enough!" Samuel roared, rounding on his wife with a fury that made her flinch. "You will be silent, woman, and remember your place. This is a matter for men to decide." "Adee!" But even as he spoke, they all heard it. That same singing from earlier drifting across the water, closer now. The melody was hypnotic and disturbing in equal measure, and as they listened, they could make out multiple voices joining in harmony. Looking downstream, they saw a sight that would haunt their nightmares for years to come. Dozens of figures were emerging from the river, walking through the shallows toward the bank. At first, in the harsh midday sun and the heat shimmer rising from the water, it was hard to make out details. But as they drew closer, it became clear that these were more bodies, some fresh, some partially decomposed, some reduced to little more than bones held together by tattered flesh. All bore the strange markings, all moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, and all were singing that haunting song in voices that should not have been capable of sound. "Run!" Reverend Cotton whispered, his Bible slipping from nerveless fingers. "Run! Run!" The word became a scream as the congregation of the drowned continued their advance, and suddenly everyone was scrambling backward, climbing the muddy bank, fleeing toward the perceived safety of the plantation. The enslaved workers ran alongside their masters, all distinctions of status momentarily forgotten in the face of this incomprehensible horror. Behind them, the singing grew louder, joined by other sounds, splashing water, creaking joints, the wet slap of feet on mud. They burst into the plantation compound in a panicked mass, and Blackwood immediately began shouting orders. "Bar the doors! Get weapons! Someone ride to Jamestown for militia!" But even as he gave commands, he must have known how absurd they sounded. What good were muskets and swords against the dead? What militia could stand against the river's judgment? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the first of the river's children reached the edge of the tobacco fields. They stood there, a silent assembly of the wronged dead, their marked bodies glistening in the late afternoon light. They made no move to advance further, simply stood and watched the plantation with eyes that reflected no light. And they sang, that endless haunting song that seemed to seep into the bones of everyone who heard it, a melody of accusation and sorrow that no amount of distance could diminish. Night fell over the Blackwood plantation, and for the first time since the English had arrived in Virginia, the darkness felt truly hostile, pregnant with possibilities that civilization had tried to deny. While everyone barricaded themselves in the plantation house or the sturdiest of the outbuildings, Kwame stood at the window of the slave quarters, watching the figures at the field's edge. He was not afraid. He was waiting to see what price the river would demand for all those years of bodies and blood and buried crimes. And somewhere deep in his chest, in a place that remembered his homeland and his freedom and his name before slavery, he felt something that might have been hope, terrible and dark and uncompromising as the river itself. The siege lasted 3 days and 3 nights, though the dead made no aggressive move toward the living. They simply stood at the edge of the fields, their numbers growing as more bodies emerged from the James River, walking upstream or down, depending on where the current had originally carried them. By the second day, there were more than 100 figures surrounding the plantation, a silent congregation of the drowned bearing witness to the living who had sent them to their watery graves. No one from the plantation dared venture beyond the immediate compound. The few who had tried, including 2 of Pharaoh's men who had attempted to ride for Jamestown, had found their horses refusing to move past the line of the dead, rearing and screaming in terror until their riders gave up and retreated. The singing continued without pause, day and night, that strange multilingual chorus that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the skull. Some began to recognize fragments of the songs, African chants, Native American prayers, snatches of English psalms, all woven together into something new and terrible. Inside the plantation house, the planters had gathered in Blackwood's study, their faces haggard from lack of sleep. Reverend Cotton had spent the first day praying, but by the second, he had lapsed into a catatonic silence, sitting in a corner and staring at nothing. The Bible lay forgotten at his feet, its pages unable to provide comfort or answers to what they were witnessing. "We're being punished," William Farrow said, breaking a long silence. His voice was hoarse from exhaustion. God or the devil or something else, we're being held accountable for what we've done. We've done nothing, Blackwood insisted, though his words lacked conviction. We've built a colony here. We've brought civilization to a wilderness. If harsh measures were sometimes necessary to maintain order and ensure survival, harsh measures. Sarah Blackwood's laugh was bitter and edged with hysteria. She had spent the past 2 days alternating between prayer and brandy, and her eyes now held a wild gleam. You threw a boy into the river based on a lie. Don't think I haven't figured it out, Samuel. That silver buckle, it was planted. Harrow did it because Kofi was teaching some of the others to read, wasn't he? Teaching them from that Bible you gave him to civilize them. He was becoming too educated, too aware, too dangerous to your precious order. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Blackwood's face flushed red, then white. Harrow, standing near the door, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The truth had been obvious to anyone willing to see it. Kofi had been murdered not for theft, but for the crime of becoming too human in the eyes of his oppressors, for threatening the comfortable fiction that enslaved people were somehow less than fully human and therefore undeserving of basic dignity or justice. "It doesn't matter now," one of the other planters muttered. "What's done is done. The question is, how do we end this? How do we make them go away? Give them what they want." Kwame's voice came from the doorway, startling everyone. He had entered the house uninvited, another transgression that would normally have earned severe punishment, but no one moved to stop him. The old man's eyes swept across the assembled white faces, and what they saw there made them shrink back. The dead have come for justice. Give it to them, and maybe they go back to the river. Justice? Harrow finally found his voice, anger replacing his fear. What justice? They're dead. There's no bringing them back. No, Kwame agreed, but there is confession. There is truth. There is, he paused, searching for the right English word, accounting. You have taken much, taken lives, taken freedom, taken names and families and futures. The river wants accounting. Samuel Blackwood stood slowly, his face hardening into the mask of authority he had worn for so long. "I will not be dictated to by slaves or whatever those things are outside. I am master here. I answer to God and the King and the Virginia Company, not to—" His words were cut short by a tremendous crack of thunder, though the sky outside remained clear. The house shook, and for a moment it felt as if the earth itself was shifting beneath their feet. When the rumbling ceased, they heard a new sound. Footsteps on the porch, dozens of them, and the creak of wood as weight settled on the boards. The dead had crossed the boundary they had maintained for 3 days. They were at the door. "Open!" a voice called from outside, speaking in English but with an accent that belonged to no single place or time. "Open and face what you have made." The door to the study flew open despite having been barred, the heavy wooden beams splintering like kindling. Standing in the doorway was Kofi, or what had been Kofi. His body was still marked with the strange symbols, still swollen and distorted from his time in the river, but his eyes held an intelligence and power that had nothing to do with the meek young man who had once worked these fields. Behind him, visible through the windows and the open door, stood the full assembly of the drowned, packed into the house and filling every corner with their wet, cold presence. "You will hear," Kofi's voice said, though his lips barely moved. "You will hear every story, every life you ended, every soul you threw away like refuse. You will hear, and you will remember, and you will carry the weight of what you have done." What followed was a night that none of the survivors would ever be able to fully describe or explain. One by one, the dead spoke, their voices overlapping and echoing, telling stories of lives stolen and bodies disposed of. An African woman torn from her children and sold, who had walked into the river when the grief became too much to bear. A Powhatan man murdered after refusing to give up his family's land. His body weighted with stones and sunk in the deep water. An Irish indentured servant beaten to death for speaking back to his master, his corpse dumped from a boat in the middle of the night. The stories went on and on, a litany of suffering and injustice, each one forcing the living to confront the human cost of their colony, their prosperity, their way of life. Some of the planters wept, others sat in stony silence. Harrow tried to flee at one point, but found his legs wouldn't obey him, rooted to the floor by some unseen force. And through it all, the symbols on the dead bodies glowed brighter, illuminating the room with an eerie phosphorescence. When the first light of dawn began to seep through the windows, the dead finally fell silent. Kofi, or the thing wearing his form, fixed his gaze on Samuel Blackwood. "The river has spoken. Now you must choose. Change, or let the water claim you all. The spirits that dwell in this land are older than your kings and your gods. They were here before you came, and they will be here after you are dust. They do not judge by the color of skin or the language of prayer. They judge by the weight of blood in the water." "What do you want from us?" Blackwood asked, his voice broken. "What penance will satisfy—" "Freedom," Kwame interrupted, stepping forward to stand beside Kofi's transformed body. "Freedom for all the enslaved, justice for the murdered, recognition that every life has worth, not just those you deem civilized or Christian or white. The river wants balance. You have taken too much for too long." "Impossible," Pharaoh said, though his voice held no strength. "We can't just free our slaves, the economy, the colony. It all depends on—" "Then the river will take you all," Kofi's voice said simply. "One by one, in dreams or waking, the water will call you, and you will answer. Unless you choose differently, unless you change." As the sun rose fully over the Virginia wilderness, painting the tobacco fields in shades of gold and green, the dead began to retreat. They moved slowly, deliberately, back toward the river, their singing fading into the morning bird calls. Within an hour, they had all disappeared beneath the water's surface, leaving behind only muddy footprints and the lingering smell of river water and decay. The living stood in the wreckage of the plantation house, looking at each other with haunted eyes. Some would try to forget what they had witnessed, would convince themselves it had been mass hysteria or fever dreams. But others, including Samuel Blackwood, who found himself unable to look at his wife or meet his own reflection in the mirror, knew that something fundamental had changed. The river had spoken, and the message could not be unheard. In the weeks that followed, strange stories began to circulate through the Virginia colony. The Blackwood plantation was abandoned, Samuel having suffered what the doctors called a complete nervous collapse. Several other planters in the region freed their slaves, claiming religious revelations or economic impracticality, though those who looked closely could see the fear in their eyes. The James River continued to flow as it always had, giving no sign of the dead who had walked from its depths, though fishermen would sometimes report seeing strange lights beneath the water at night, or hearing singing that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Kwame eventually made his way north, helping to establish one of the first communities of free blacks in the colonies. He carried with him the memory of those 3 days and nights, the knowledge that sometimes the land itself rises up to demand justice when humanity fails to provide it. He told the story to his children and grandchildren, though he softened some of the details, made it more like a legend than the terrifying reality it had been. Sarah Blackwood returned to Jamestown and never remarried. She spent the rest of her life working with missionaries to improve conditions for enslaved people, though she never spoke publicly about what she had witnessed that spring. In her private journal, discovered years after her death, she wrote, "We believed we were bringing light to a dark land, but we were the darkness. The river showed us the truth of what we had become, and that truth was more terrible than any nightmare I could have imagined." As for Kofi, his body was never found in the weeks after the siege ended. Some said he had returned to the river, his purpose fulfilled. Others claimed to see him sometimes, walking along the water's edge at twilight, his form shimmering between human and something else, watching over the James River and all its secrets. The symbols that had marked his flesh became a subject of study for scholars in later years, though no one could ever quite agree on their origin or meaning. Some thought they were African, others Native American. Still others claimed they belonged to no earthly culture at all, but were instead the language of the land itself, written in flesh and water and the accumulated weight of injustice. The Virginia colony continued to grow, the institution of slavery becoming more entrenched rather than less, despite the warnings that the James River had delivered. Human beings have a remarkable capacity to forget, to rationalize, to convince themselves that what they witnessed couldn't have really happened, not in that way. The dead remained silent for many years, their bodies staying beneath the water where they had been sent, perhaps waiting, perhaps sleeping, perhaps judging. But on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the water runs swift and cold, people living near the James River still report strange phenomena. Singing that seems to come from beneath the surface, lights that dance on the water like marsh gas but move with purpose and intelligence. And sometimes, very rarely, a body will wash up on shore bearing marks that no doctor can explain, symbols that seem to shift and change when you look at them directly, as if the river is still trying to tell its story to anyone willing to listen. The truth is that the land remembers everything. Every drop of blood spilled, every injustice committed, every life taken before its time, all of it soaks into the soil and the water, becoming part of the foundation on which new generations build their lives. And sometimes, when the weight becomes too great, when the accumulated suffering reaches a critical mass, the land speaks back. It speaks in symbols and songs, in the voices of the dead, in rivers that run backward and bodies that rise to bear witness. This is the story of 1603, of the James River and the Blackwood plantation, of Kofi and Kwame, and all the nameless souls who were thrown into the water and forgotten. It is a story about justice delayed, but not denied, about the price of building prosperity on the suffering of others, about how the past never really stays buried, no matter how deep you try to hide it. And while the overseer ordered the slave to be thrown into the river that spring morning so long ago, inexplicable what they found was not just one transformed body, but a mirror held up to an entire society, forcing them to see what they had become and what they had done. Some looked into that mirror and turned away. Others looked and were changed forever, carrying the weight of that revelation through all their remaining days. The James River flows on, as it has for thousands of years, carrying its secrets and its stories toward the sea. But those who live along its banks know, even if they don't speak of it openly, that the water remembers. And on dark nights, when the wind carries the scent of rain and the sound of distant singing, they lock their doors and say their prayers and hope that the river's patience, whatever remains of it, will last just a little longer. Because the dead are always waiting, beneath the surface, marked with the truth that the living tried to drown. And someday, perhaps, the river will speak again.